Hi guys, it's Mark Zickery, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zickery of Space Command and many other things. And I have a story to tell today that has never been told in this way. And I think you'll find it very, very interesting, as it includes two of my favorite science fiction writers. Now, I'll jump into that in just a moment. We just finished shooting a day of Elaine's film, When the Voiceless Roar, on Friday. It went great. We're ramping up to shoot more of Space Command, The Great Solar War, and you can be a part of it. We're about to have a Zoom call with Rockne O'Bannon, whom I'm creating Sweet Haven with, and with Ethan McDowell, our star in Space Command, and Elaine and myself, to talk to our investors about how things are going and where we're headed. And if you'd like to be included in that call, let me know, because we're raising money to be able to shoot all this. Shares are $7,500 each, and it's going to be a very, very bright future. At least the signs are definitely portending that way. So, but meantime, and don't forget to subscribe, ding the bell, notify, all that stuff. But here's the story. Okay, there's two of my favorite writers are Kurt Vonnegut, and a writer who was born with the name, let's see, where is it? Here we are, Edward Hamilton Waldo. But you know him, and I knew him, as Theodore Sturgeon. He was one of the greats of science fiction. Not well known nowadays, but you can't go wrong reading Sturgeon. He's phenomenal. So, let's get into it. How these two men, how their paths crossed, and what led to that. Well, now, Vonnegut worked for General Electric, but he wanted to be a writer. And so once he left General Electric, he decided to write a novel about it, put in a science fictional context. Now, often people don't think of Vonnegut as a science fiction writer, but I do, because many, many of his greatest works had science fiction elements. For instance, The Sirens of Titan takes place in, other parts of time and space. His great book, perhaps the greatest book he ever wrote, Slaughterhouse-Five, involves time travel and the characters, sliding through time. And many of his short stories included tales of, future dystopias and all sorts of stuff. And Timequake, of course, also involved time travel. And Galapagos involved the end of humanity. And certainly the one about Ice Nine, Cat's Cradle, involved the end of the world. These are science fiction stories. And but fortunately, Vonnegut, because he decried science fiction and science fiction writers, he was able to manage to be considered a mainstream writer and a satirist. And he was both one of my dad's favorite writers and one of my favorite writers, which I don't think we never talked about other writers that we both loved that way. So I think we loved Vonnegut for different reasons. But we'll get into that later, maybe. But here's the story. So Vonnegut wrote his first novel, Player Piano, in the early 50s, and it got good reviews. And by the way, this is a first edition, and you can see it says Womrath's Bookshops and Libraries Incorporated. And I love things that personalize an individual edition of a book. So this is the first edition in original dust jacket, and it got good reviews, reasonably good reviews, but it didn't sell that well. And Vonnegut was in his middle years. He was trying to figure out how to support himself and his family, and was really at a crossroads. So he bought a car dealership in Cape Cod and started selling cars, and he came up with an idea for a board game. Now, it was not published during his life, but I went to the LA Times Festival of Books a couple weekends ago, and I found a booth for the Kurt Vonnegut Museum, which I'd never heard of, and they had a lot of cool items for sale. Now, when they went through Vonnegut's effects after he passed away, he had worked on a board game that he thought could rival checkers and chess, and he submitted it, and it didn't get sold, didn't get made, but the museum decided to make that game, and I bought it. So here it is, Kurt Vonnegut, GHQ, General Headquarters, The Lost Board Game. I highly recommend this. It's very cool. It has an introduction by James S.A. Corey, the duo that write the Expanse novels and more, and it is incredibly cool. And this is what Vonnegut looked like at the time. So you can see that man who wants to be a writer, who wants to be famous, and has not achieved it yet. And but around the same, now this is, by the way, this is Vonnegut in later years. This is the Vonnegut that we all know and love. Let me see if I can get that position so it doesn't reflect. There. Now, so Vonnegut later would publish other books, start to gain a foothold, and then in the mid-60s would hit it big with Slaughterhouse-Five. But some of his other books include, as I mentioned, Sirens of Titan, which is I love most of these books. Mother Night. There we go. And a very rare book of his, a short story collection called Canary in a Cat House. Now, the fun part about these two books, unless they were published by Gold Medal, at the time, the editor at Gold Medal who oversaw these books was Harlan Ellison, and that is why they have Leo and Diane Dillon covers, because these were the artists who were his cover artists, and that's why they are wonderful and beautiful books, and I love them. So, and Mother Night is also a terrific book, not science fiction, but definitely wonderful, and it was not made into a great movie, but it is a wonderful book. Now, at the same time, through the 50s, around this period that Kurt Vonnegut was selling cars and trying to sell a board game, Ted Sturgeon was writing books like this, More Than Human, a classic of the genre. And you can see it's a very cool cover. And he was kind of struggling. He was writing short stories and novels and making a living, but just barely. Sturgeon had come out of the Merchant Marine. He'd worked a bulldozer. He'd done many, many, many things in his career. But he actually started selling stories at a fairly young age. And so he was, by the time Vonnegut met him, when Vonnegut was selling cars, Sturgeon was already a highly regarded science fiction writer, if not wealthy. He was basically writing for a few pennies a word for magazines, selling a novel for maybe $1,000 when he could. Ted in later years, became a very dear friend of mine and a mentor. And, he was a dear, dear soul, and I loved knowing him. And my photo of Ted Sturgeon appears on several of his books as his author's photo, and I'm very proud of that. And but so here's what happened. So Vonnegut meets Sturgeon, and they become friends. And at the time, Vonnegut's just a guy who's published a few things, not really made it. He's a car salesman. Sturgeon at the same time is writing. He's already had over a decade of success as a writer, and he's the big name writer to Vonnegut, and yet Vonnegut observes, Vonnegut asks him tons of questions about the writer's life and how to make a living as a writer, and Ted Sturgeon mentors him, essentially, is very kind to him, as he was very kind to me and mentored me. But the fun part is, and what makes this such a remarkable story in literary history, is Vonnegut starts to then sell, and he becomes one of the great writers of the 20th century with a unique satirical voice. And somewhere along the lines, Vonnegut realized that in addition to writing novels, he might have an idea for a science fiction novel, but he wouldn't need to write the novel. He could just describe it within one of his books and get the point across and not have to write the book. But he had to have a character who was writing those novels in the books that Vonnegut himself was writing. So he remembered Theodore Sturgeon, and now Theodore Sturgeon was writing book after book, story after story, publishing some of them in obscure science fiction magazines, and even some of them in sort of these sleazy men's magazines that had to have a certain amount of printed material within their pages to justify a postal rate so they could be shipped affordably. And so they would be publishing short stories that most of the buyers would not be reading. And Ted Sturgeon was publishing in men's magazines like Adam and Rogue. These were sort of second-rate Playboy knockoff kind of magazines. And again, being paid a few pennies a word for those stories, and just enough to get by. So Vonnegut decided to use Theodore Sturgeon as the template for the writer who would write these ridiculous novels that he would basically synopsize in his full novels. So he took the name Theodore and changed that slightly to Kilgore, and Sturgeon to another fish, Trout, and thus Theodore Sturgeon became Kilgore Trout. Now, Kilgore Trout is almost as famous as Kurt Vonnegut. He's a great character that goes from novel to novel, is in many of Vonnegut's novels, and and is a sort of whimsical, bedraggled, eccentric character who is often not even regarded as a writer. And Ted Sturgeon told me a very funny story that, or I think it was Michael Reeves, who was another protege of Sturgeon's and a dear friend of mine. Michael told me that one time he was with Ted Sturgeon in a like a bus station, and Ted saw a teenager reading one of his books. So he went up to the teenager and said, "You shouldn't be reading that garbage." And the kid said, "You're right," and threw it in the trash. And Michael said Ted got what he deserved for doing that. but Ted, again, was an elegant and wonderful writer, and those of us who are writers admire him enormously. Ray Bradbury admired him. In fact, Ray's first book, Ted wrote the introduction, and so it's really a remarkable thing. And so, here we are, and I love both the novels of Kurt Vonnegut and the synopsized novels of Kilgore Trout. In fact, I actually pitched an idea for an anthology show called Trout and Sturgeon, which would have been alternating adaptations of Kilgore Trout's stories and Theodore Sturgeon's, and that would have been a lot of fun. But here's another fun thing. So many science fiction writers who had been writing for a few pennies a word, scraping by on $1,000 to $3,000 per novel, identified with Kilgore Trout, even though they were not the template that it was based on. Now, during his lifetime, Vonnegut never, always denied that Theodore Sturgeon was his template for Kilgore Trout, and though it was very obvious, and Theodore Sturgeon was not as low rent a character as Kilgore Trout was. Kilgore Trout always seemed like a rumpled, kind of more like a Charles Bukowski kind of character, writing science fiction, kind of being blown where the wind blew him. Whereas Ted Sturgeon had an elegance and a brilliance. Just talking to him, he was so astonishingly well-read and knowledgeable, and a thinker of that looked things very differently from other people, but in a very interesting and brilliant way. He was truly one of a kind. He was a guest at our wedding, and he was also, I did an interview with him that I published as part of my first book, 3 Interviews on Media and Society, where I interviewed George Clayton Johnson, the great Ron Cobb, and Ted Sturgeon. It's a book I wrote while I was in college, and you can find it on Amazon now, I believe. So, but anyway, back to this. So when I went to Kilgore Trout, many writers identified with him, said, "That's me." And one of those writers was Philip Jose Farmer, who ultimately would get fame with and win a Hugo for his book, To Your Scattered Bodies Go. He created Riverworld, which he wrote many novels about, but he wrote tons and tons of stories and novels and all sorts of stuff. And at one point, he wrote a Kilgore Trout novel called Venus on the Half Shell, and it came out under the name Kilgore Trout. And a lot of people thought it was by Vonnegut, but it wasn't. It was by Philip Jose Farmer, who ultimately came clean about it. You can still find it on eBay and Amazon and so forth. But one of the fun things they had at the Vonnegut Museum tent at the LA Book Festival was these postcards that are Kilgore Trout novels based on the descriptions throughout Vonnegut's works. And so I'll show them to you and read the text. So here's one called The Gutless Wonder, which of course is a parody of the poster for Gone with the Wind, but instead of Clark Gable, you've got a robot. And it says, "The Gutless Wonder of Kilgore Trout, for entertainment of adults only, sale to minors prohibited." $1.95. And then here's one called Plague on Wheels. Now, these are all novels that were mentioned in Vonnegut's books as being by Kilgore Trout, and he would offer these ridiculous synopses of them. So here's what it says about this. Plague on Wheels by Kilgore Trout, for entertainment of adults only, satanic biker gang orgies, wild outlaw women, planetary extinction. That's just too great. And here's another one. This is Pan-Galactic Memory Bank by Kilgore Trout. And what it says about that is, for entertainment of adults only, sale to minors prohibited by Kilgore Trout. Pan-Galactic Memory Bank. So great, published by World Classics. So then, this is one of the best titles that Kilgore Trout's books had. Mouth Crazy, Kilgore Trout. And the synopsis of that includes story The Pan-Galactic Straw Boss by Kilgore Trout, adults only. So here's another one. Smart Bunny Kilgore Trout. And it says, intelligence is a disease. So very, very fun. And 95 cents. And for entertainment of adults only. And then here's another one. To be or not to be. Okay. To be or not to be. And it says, what the hell are human beings for? For the entertainment of adults only. And then this final one. Now the story can be told by Kilgore Trout. And it says, you're God's own lab rat. Human beings are machines, eating machines, crying machines, fucking machines, killing machines. Man is alone in the universe with topless teens, wide open beavers inside. Whoop, I dropped it. Ah, there it is. Now the story can be told. Wonderful, just wonderful. So that's the story. So Theodore Sturgeon mentors Kurt Vonnegut, whom fictionalizes him into Kilgore Trout, and it all circles around and circles around and circles around. So fascinating stuff. And you can read more about Kilgore Trout in, I believe there was a deluxe edition of Venus on the Half Shell by Philip Jose Farmer that goes into Kilgore Trout's journey and how Philip Jose Farmer was able to publish that novel. And but meantime, if you've never read Kurt Vonnegut, I would urge you to start doing so. You might read Slaughterhouse-Five first. Vonnegut was in the firebombing of Dresden that killed over 100,000 people, and he was a POW there. And this is his story about it, which took him many years to write. And it's a phenomenal book. It was made into a very good film in the 60s, I think, or early 70s, I think, by George Roy Hill. And almost any of the other Vonnegut novels, you'll be well served. In fact, Vonnegut actually graded his own novels at one point, and he was fairly harsh on some of his books. But definitely check out Vonnegut, check out Sturgeon, and we will continue this next time on Mr. Sci-Fi. But I hope you enjoyed this piece of information from the other side, the side where I was told many of these stories and learned many of these things from people firsthand. So that's about it for now, and we will talk again next time. Bye, guys.